Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Weil, Director of External Affairs for CSET, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. Today, you'll hear and take part in a discussion about how the United States, through the US government and through other means, can prepare an innovative workforce for the future. But before we start, I'd like to do a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and you experience any technical difficulties, use the chat function at the bottom of the screen and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Don't use the chat for anything else just yet. We'll come back to it in a little bit after the presentation. And now it's my pleasure to hand the reins over to our moderator. Anna Puglisi is the Director of Biotechnology Programs and a Senior Fellow with CSET. She previously served as the National Counterintelligence Officer for East Asia, advising US and foreign government officials at the highest levels, academia, and the private sector on counterintelligence issues. As a member of the Senior Analytics Service, she developed multidisciplinary efforts to understand global technology developments and their impact on US competitiveness and national security, as well as efforts to target US technology. She has received numerous awards and honors, including the FBI Director's Award for Excellence. Anna is a co-author of the 2013 study, Chinese Industrial Espionage, the first book-length treatment of the topic, as well as countless related proprietary studies. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. Hello, everyone. How the US can compete in the 21st century is one of the most vexing challenges on the minds of policymakers and academics today. Many groups are exploring a mix of policy options and actions that will enable the US to shore up its national innovation base and grow the talent and workforce that will be needed for industries of the future. What will this workforce look like? Future US economic competitiveness and national security will rely not only on a robust base of talent to develop cutting-edge systems, but also on the broader US workforce having a baseline technical proficiency. The challenge of the US remaining competitive in those industries of the future is even more daunting against the backdrop of a nation state, China, keen on dominating key technology areas of future industries and warfare, as well as an increasing globalized scientific base that fights for that talent. However, there's no consensus on the appropriate role of government in spurring innovation and shoring up US competitiveness and training that future workforce. Whether it's K-12 STEM education, community colleges, training programs, or universities, we need to ask, what does investing in STEM education actually consist of? And what mechanisms do you need to actually reach people of all different backgrounds and interests? Two narratives have framed the discussion on how best to encourage and sustain a national innovation system and the talent that it needs. One narrative suggests that the US has been successful in fostering creativity, entrepreneurship, and innovation, largely because the government has employed a free market or laissez-faire approach. In this narrative, the lack of government intervention, represented by a light regulatory touch and limited involvement in workforce development, has allowed the private sector to thrive. A second narrative is built around the failures of the Soviet Union and China in the 70s through the 90s to develop a robust innovation system. In this narrative, rigid and centralized control in communist states in all aspects of economic activity carries over to the scientific endeavor, stifles innovation, and disincentivizes individual and business creativity. And more specifically, China, with its centralized system and lack of democracy, stifles innovation. This heavy hand narrative stands in sharp contrast to the invisible hand of the liberal Western democracies. But what does that really mean in the context of talent? These two narratives suggest a choice between no interventions to grow the workforce and talent of the future, or a centralized policy to do so. However, in reality, and what we will explore today, the lines are not so stark. Today, our two experts will unpack the issue of talent and the role it plays in the national innovation base and future competition, as well as explore the nuances of these key issues. So first, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Chike Agu, who is currently the Chief Information Officer at the U.S. Department of Labor. and who focuses on the future of work, as well as its impacts on and opportunities for nations, organizations, workers, and underserved communities. He was a 2020 to 21 Technology and Human Rights Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights, where he focused on the future of work and its impacts on racial equality. Previously, he had served as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on the Future of Work, inaugural Future of Work Fellow at the International Society for Technology and Education, and expert advisor to the American AI Forum. Previously, he worked as an education policy official under the Mayor of New York, second grade teacher and Teach for America Corps member. He was a Fulbright scholar in Thailand, researching education and skills. The director of corporate strategy at the advisory board company's higher education arm, and CEO of a national social enterprise, which helped connect 500,000 low-income Americans in 48 different states to affordable internet and digital skills. He is a partner at Maryland-based Incubate, which grows innovation businesses and ecosystems, particularly in communities that need them most. Chike and his work have been featured at or in the White House, at Harvard, at CNN Money, Forbes, Wired Magazine, and Fast Company. Chike, over to you.
Thank you so much for that overly generous introduction. And really, my goal here is, I think, to kind of frame the question and really dive into conversation. And just really excited to be here with my colleagues and with so many of you who have joined us from, I'm sure, the DC area, but also around the world. As was said, I have the honor of serving here as the Chief Innovation Officer at the Department of Labor. I was appointed and sworn in on day one of the administration in January of last year. And what I want to do is first, I think, frame the economic situation that we frankly were in 2021 as well as now. Talk about this intersection of kind of national security and economics, particularly talent. And then last, we'll talk about some priorities from the outset that hit that get at, of course, the national security implications, but also I think broader economic equality, kind of economic vitality that I think we all think are important, but particularly from the Department of Labor's perspective. So I started in this administration in January 20th of last year, and I want to put out a couple of I want to just put out a couple of numbers. You know, if you look at the pandemic, the worst month of job loss was either November or December of 2008, where we lost between 800,000 and 900,000 jobs. In March of 2020, April of 2020, 8 million jobs evaporated because of pandemic lockdowns, which at that time were seen to be necessary because we wanted to stop the spread of the disease. Let me use another stat, which was, if you look at before the pandemic, the record for new unemployment claims filed in a single week was in October of 82, I believe was about 687,000. I might be off by a few thousand. 687,000 in October of 82, the year before I was born. When I came into this administration, there were weeks where we had 3 million, 4 million, 5 million. I think the record we had during the pandemic was 6.6 million new unemployment claims in a single week. Just to put it in perspective, between March of 2020 and April of 2021, we, as a federal government, gave out almost $800 billion in benefits to over 53 million Americans, probably almost a third of the US workforce. That was the situation that we were in. And in many ways, we have been looking to climb out of that hole since then and have come very, very close to recovering almost all of those jobs. But what I think this uncovered, or frankly, even kind of reinforced it and exacerbated, was some base needs and intersections that we have between that connect a vital economy and the American workforce. We saw it in what we would call critical supply chain industries. I think we've all learned more about supply chains in the last year and a half than we ever wanted. But one of the things that's very clear is that supply chains are not just about raw materials. When you think about semiconductors or ventilators, the raw materials don't just show up and put themselves together. You need people there to put those together who have the right skills, right mindsets, organized in the right way. And to be honest, we've seen breakdowns in parts of our supply chain because of that. Similarly, when we think about the emerging technology industries that we want to lead it in the next, frankly, 2, 5, 10 years for a lot of the countries that we frame as competitors, whether it be China or anyone else, AI, machine learning, 5G, space, autonomous vehicles, UAVs, pick your industry. Again, workforce is key there. And there is no way to dominate those industries without having a skilled workforce at the center of that. I think as we think about that, I think there are a couple of frames that I want to put on our conversation that I think are really important, or things I think that partially I've realized, partially I think we've realized as an administration, I think more broadly as a country. I think number one, we have come to an understanding of what a STEM job is. Let me talk about what a STEM job is. I think when I was growing up, I think we thought of STEM jobs as, frankly, the fancy folks who did all the equations and wore white coats and had PhDs and masters. I think what we've seen is STEM jobs is on the other end of the spectrum. There's almost no job in this society that does not require some knowledge of technology and digital services and skills. Again, if you think about our frontline workers, or who we were calling essential workers during the pandemic, if you were working in a store doing shelf restocking, you were using usually an iPhone-enabled device to be able to do that cataloging. That required knowledge of those skills. I think similarly, we have to reconsider what we think are STEM skills. You heard the framing of kind of, again, those what I call timeless skills that we've been teaching since ancient times, of leadership, communication, collaboration across difference, so on and so forth. And then also kind of the more standard technical skills that we think make a STEM job. And the answer is they are both STEM skills. If you go to any manufacturer, anyone who's in this space, particularly when thinking about who do I not just want to come in entry-level positions, but rise through the ranks of my company, they need both of those. And so when you think about creating that workforce, we need both. I think the last thing I'll say is what's happened very interestingly in many of these, particularly emerging technology fields, is you will have kind of your cadre of PhDs and master's folks who again are your kind of classic white coats. What we're beginning to see now is this growth in what we would call kind of skilled technical workforce in positions that are critical, actually what we consider good jobs, critical to the creation of whatever the good or service is within that field, but not necessarily requiring that college degree. I'll use an example. For the emerging space industry, which has seen more capital flow into it than in its entire history. And you look at folks who are helping to build rockets that are bigger than the Saturn V. Yes, they need their masters and PhDs, aerospace engineers, but they also need welders and fabricators. They also need folks who can do quality control. They also need folks who do non-destructive testing. These are fields that actually you see in other skilled trades, but actually are really critical for that space industry. So there is this space kind of in between that is becoming really critical, and that is an acute need for so many folks firms who are within these spaces. So I think that's one. We have to rethink what a STEM job is, rethink what a STEM skill is, and how we get that to more and more people. I think next, we have to really attack two simultaneous problems. And in many ways, realize that those two problems can solve each other. One problem we have is, bluntly, we do not have enough people in many of these roles, particularly in emerging technology industries or in these critical supply chain industries that we need. I think secondly, we also have to realize that there are communities that for as long as this country has been in existence that we have frankly underserved and overlooked and have created and have in some ways cordoned off from these most desirable professions. These are communities populated by Black and brown people. These are communities populated by immigrants. These are communities that are rural, that are low income. And what's interesting is that those communities that I named are actually the growing parts of the country. And so in many ways, as we think about in industry, I need to fill these jobs. And in communities, we need jobs. These two things can find each other, but it requires companies and really the entire ecosystem to behave differently. So when I hear a company, and I talk to companies on a regular basis here, I can't find the workers that I need. The question I ask is, where are you looking? And I think it's going to require companies to look in communities differently than they ever have before. It's going to require different types of mechanisms, using skills-based hiring and really deciding, do I need a college degree for this? Or is there a way that I can assess if someone has those skills? Because we know much research has been on this at places like Opportunity at Work, on the barrier that arbitrary four-year degrees can put on a certain jobs, particularly for people of color, and also can actually keep people who can do the job from getting the job and can hurt the bottom line of a company. I think, secondly, as we are creating these tools, whether it be, again, AI, machine learning, or anything else, we need that workforce to be as diverse as possible. Number one, so we can get our numbers, but two, so we're creating the best tools. We have all read stories of tools created by, frankly, monochromatic groups that, frankly, didn't do what they were supposed to. Facial recognition tools that, frankly, have a hard time recognizing people of darker skin, because, frankly, people with darker skin were involved in creating it, which makes a worse product. And so, again, there's an economic impact as well as an impact on the field. Here's the last thing I'll say. Talent is, and the innovation workforce is table stakes, and it's really going to be the limiting factor for US leading within this space. I would also argue that this is a critical piece of American soft power. It is critical for us as we think about the competing ideologies, competing frameworks of government and in the world, that we show that the American one is better. And in some ways, the best way to do that is to be able to show that economically, for the parts of our economy that are growing the most, that everyone in our country can benefit. If we do that, we create an economy that not only makes us prosperous, but it also makes us proud. And most importantly, allows us, and particularly I think about our diplomats and those who represent the US around the world, to have the best case to show that in some ways the American way, if we want to use that term, is the way that, again, can lead, it can show the way for many others around the world towards the type of future that they want for themselves and for their children. So let me stop there. I've already said too much, and really I throw it back to Anna to lead the rest of our conversation.
Thank you so much, TK. At this point, I'm going to introduce Diana Gelhaus, who's also here at CSET. She is a research fellow. Prior to CSET, she was a doctoral fellow at the RAND Corporation, receiving her PhD in policy analysis from the Pardee RAND Graduate School. Her research focuses on the intersection of tech and talent, including domestic talent pipelines in AI and other emerging technologies, workforce development and education policy, youth career educational decision-making, and trends in employer hiring. Prior to RAND, she was an economist and director of the Young American Prosperity Project at the Progressive Policy Institute, a policy analyst at the U.S. Export-Import Bank, and an economist for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. She has an MA in Applied Economics from Johns Hopkins University and a BA in Mathematics and Applied Economics from Bucknell University. Her media appearances include CNBC, Comcast Newsmakers, Wisconsin Public Radio, The Richard Fowler Show. Her research and commentary have been featured in The Hill, USA Today, Fortune, The Washington Post, and the Harvard Business Review. Over to you, Diana.
Thanks, Anna, also for that glowing introduction. And I'm really excited for this discussion because so much of what Chike talked about is really prevalent and an important part of this conversation. And what I really like about how the discussion has been framed is, Anna, your remarks really talked about this idea of government involvement, and that's really at the core of a lot of this conversation. So the role of government at the federal and state and local level in helping cultivate workforce pathways, in helping build an innovation workforce for the future. But also, as Chike pointed out, there's many dimensions to this conversation. And some of this you could even see in things like the CHIPS Plus Act, right? I am at CSET, we think a lot about the role of community colleges, certifications, credentials, and the role of alternative pathways in creating opportunity for all workers. So again, getting at some of those larger picture challenges that Chike really saliently identified. I'm just going to quickly mention 5 bites that we're trying to take out of this conversation right now because there are so many dimensions. 2 pieces just we came out today I'm really excited about. One is talking about the role of competitions by my colleagues, Allie Crawford and Kayla Good, really getting at how we can get young kids more involved earlier with competitions, thinking about cybersecurity, engaged, learning, and maybe building that interest and expertise in middle school and also in high school. Another piece, also thinking about the K-12 part of this conversation, is thinking about a state level agenda for AI education and how that could factor into curricula that's already there, building on the computer science conversation. I'm happy to get into more of that in the Q&A. three things that we're working on now that are I'm really excited about, that I think factor into this conversation as well. One is looking at the National Centers for Academic Excellence in Cybersecurity, and these are institutions designated through a program administered by the NSA and Department of Homeland Security, and these institutions help build that cybersecurity talent pipeline. So thinking about certifications, associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees. So we're really looking into this program and trying to understand how many graduates are coming out of these institutions. Another piece that we're working on is looking at tech talent flows, because again, we really want to understand, as we think about STEM talent, or rethink about STEM talent, as we think about where this talent is and where this talent is going, and what industries or communities geographically might have more access than others to this type of talent. We've been looking over time using some really novel data to understand the flows of these talent, including in and out of the national security community. And finally, we're trying to understand our competitive standing. This is a huge part of the conversation and a really big catalyst for why we're having this conversation. So we've also been looking at China's AI workforce and trying to understand, in the case of China, how they are growing and cultivating their technical talent workforce. And I'm really excited to share that with you when that also comes out. But I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Diana, for those remarks. And thanks again to Chike for the presentation about your recent work and its implications. In a moment, we will have a panel discussion and we'll be taking your questions. But first, Anna gets to exercise the moderator's prerogative and kick off the Q&A. In the meantime, if you have questions you'd like to ask of the panelists, please put them in the chat and we'll try to cover as many of them as possible. Those who are phoning in for this meeting will not be able to ask questions, and we thank you for understanding the technical limitations here. Anna, take it away.
Thank you, Lynn. So my first question is going to really be focused on a topic that both of you had brought up in your remarks. And I'd love to pull the thread a little bit on what does it really mean to have that technically proficient workforce? And we talked a little bit about those programs and what kind of things do you see need to happen in order to get some of those programs off the ground? So Chike, why don't you go ahead and start, and then we'll go over to Diana.
Sure. I think, Anna, I think you framed it in the beginning. There's been this kind of Hobbesian choice presented between kind of, again, these timeless skills and these just-in-time skills that really doesn't fit the paradigm of what you need for this technical workforce. You will hear, for example, let's just take cloud infrastructure. You will hear, if you were to go to an Amazon, and you'll hear a number of kind of very technical skill sets named, but they'll also talk to you about something called developer's mindset, which is frankly a fancy way of saying being able to think around problems and deal with things that have not been outlined, and that also being critical. I spent a good bit of my career in technology, being able to manage an agile development process, which is really about how you do project management, and how you, again, instead of getting a waterfall structure where you're trying to scale everything immediately, how do you test and iterate, so on and so forth. And so when we think about training, whether that be at the certification level, whether that be through intermediaries or nonprofits, whether that be through community colleges, how do we give both of these? I think is really, really important. I think secondly, putting on kind of the equity hat, what we generally find is if we're talking about the most underserved communities, they are least likely to get both sides of that type of training. The last piece I'll say is, I think also what we've seen here at the Department of Labor is we need different models. The classic model of you arrive fully trained to a job. I hire you because you have all the jobs I need. I as an employer don't need to do anything else. If that model ever worked, it doesn't work now. It's why you have seen the president talk about apprenticeship, literally someone arriving, learning from a master on the job, going into a job once this is over, being paid along the way. So you actually can grow a professional in your field and in your company. The reason that these models have taken shape is that is in many ways because of some of the workforce challenges that we've seen. You're seeing these models take place not just in skilled trades, but again, in the semiconductor industry, in the healthcare technology industry, in advanced manufacturing, because we need different models to bring this workforce in, to give them both sides. Again, that those timeless skill sets, those things that we are intangible, that we know are critical, and also that technical skill set, and we know that together, that's what makes someone economically indispensable and critical to your field and to your firm.
No, thank you. Diana?
So the question is about how can creating a technically proficient workforce. To me, this also gets at this idea of what is an innovation workforce versus an innovative worker. And I think innovation can come from anywhere. You don't need to have a very sophisticated technical education to have a really good idea, but what you do need is opportunity. You do need resources, right? You do need pathways to pursue your ideas. And that gets a lot into what Chike is talking about creating avenues for everyone to be able to get the education and training that they need or want, right? Have these opportunities. To me, and then this also gets into this conversation about then, what is technically proficient? What does that mean? And I think it really does start to question, should we be talking in terms of STEM, quite frankly, because maybe that's a 20th century construct for a 21st century skills platform, right? We need different combinations of skills, and therefore we should be thinking a little bit differently about what technically proficient means, because as Chike said, everyone needs some degree of this type of education, whether in data literacy, digital literacy, some understanding of responsible use of technology, right? What this technology is, what it isn't, what bias is, what bias, how can bias show out in some of the applications we use every day. And that conversation gets a little bit lost to me when we are very focused on the STEM conversation.
One last thing I'll say here, I think everything that Diana said is right. The only thing I might add is this also requires how are we defining proficient, and particularly it requires firms or ecosystems to know what the required skills are for the professions that they say that they need. I have, for those of you who are on the call who have ever done this, where you've sat with firms or people in the ecosystem and said, all right, let's look at a welder fabricator. Tell me what the skills are. And I've done this with firms where literally two people from the same firm will give you slightly different answers or radically different answers for what those skills are. Not because anyone is dumb or not doing their job, but because they may not have had that holistic conversation about all the skills that they need. I have also argued that these skills are changing and evolving so rapidly, as are new occupations coming up, that I would argue that we need some combination of really, really smart human beings plus cutting edge technology using AI and machine learning to keep up. Just to put it in perspective, if you look at ONET, which is basically the occupational database that we run here at DOL, which is considered, and probably still considered, one of the most comprehensive lists of occupations with skills. It has roughly 900 to 1,200 occupations in it. If you were to go to LinkedIn, I believe they're at right now 50,000. Now again, some are overlapping, some are so on and so on, but that's how fast the field is moving. And so the key question is, how do we figure out at this point in time what those skills are for a technically proficient workforce, what those occupations are? How are we going to keep up with that over time because of how fast many of these critical technologies are evolving? And we're going to need some combination of really, really smart, forward-looking people. And I think some of these tools like AI, machine learning, natural language processing brought together to stay on top of that.
Thank you. We do have a question from the audience related to immigrant visas. And from the conversation, though, it seems that a lot of times in regards to visas, it's focused very much on that high level of PhD, master's level of talent. Is this something that, looking for those talent flows is something with either modifying visas in one way or another that will help fill that gap?
And happy to let you take it for a first crack.
Sure. So I hear this question a lot, and particularly in the context of that top tier technical talent, where a lot of PhD talent in the United States is foreign born, who come to study here and want to stay, and is the environment such that we are welcoming and inclusive enough that everybody who wants to stay can stay. Should it be? What else do we need to do? I think that's an important conversation. I will say that I know a lot of reforms are currently under active consideration, you know, to make sure that we continue to excel in having a diverse workforce. And that is part of our diversity, right? And part of our competitiveness. But what I also always answer to this question is that it's not a substitute for the reforms that need to happen domestically. And sometimes I also worry that it crowds out that conversation that still needs to happen. It's a bit more of a short-term versus long-term discussion. I appreciate that, but we still need to have more targeted investment here, you know, more opportunity created here, more diversification and growth of pipelines here to fill the jobs that we need to be filled now, especially in the emerging science and technology workforce that maybe don't need a bachelor's degree, but as Chike so correctly pointed out, there's a huge inertia with employers in still demanding a college degree. Let's talk about that too. So to me, I think those conversations need to happen together.
I 100% agree with what's said. I mean, we will always have, as someone who is the child of immigrants, I'm literally the first person of my name born in this country. That will always be part of the tool set as it rightfully should be to meet our workforce needs. But it is one tool in the toolbox. And, you know, and imagine if the only tool in the toolbox that worked was like a hammer and everything else was kind of rusted. I want to argue that we have not kept up with our other tools, particularly domestically, in terms of creating this workforce. And again, I would argue there are communities that have lots of people who need work, who are capable of doing the work that we need done. But frankly, we have not either invested or we've not even really looked to basically using the village. So I think, again, that's one of many tools, and we have to make sure that the other ones are also up to snuff.
Thank you. And to pull on that thread a little bit more, you know, beyond defining skills needed, what is the role of industry in this? I mean, we talk a lot about public-private partnerships. However, you know, how do you envision that being actioned over time?
So let me talk at a kind of global level. So what are the things that industry needs to do? And so think about this almost as a chain. So industry has a need. I need these sort of jobs filled. Okay. The first thing to say is being really clear about the jobs that you need filled and exactly the competencies and skills that are required. This is a place where industry's proficiency at doing that is variable. So knowing exactly what they need. Some companies are great. Some companies need some help there. One. Two, okay, assuming that workforce isn't out there and doesn't exist, or they need to create it, particularly if you need to train for it, working in lockstep and co-design with training providers to develop this. And let me be really clear about what I mean. So this happens a lot with community colleges. At a community college, at the beginning of the semester, they and the company meet, they develop a curriculum. At the company says, I'll see you at the end of the semester and see what you produce. And they're shocked when they may not get exactly the workers ready for them. The places where I have seen this work really well is where literally community colleges, just as an example of one type of training provider, and companies are literally in weekly conversation during the design of and deployment of that curricula. Like someone said it once to me, so much collaboration that it is uncomfortable to actually get the workers that are needed. Last piece, this is really, really important. There needs to be a really clear on-ramp between the end of that training program into an actual job. It is assumed that once the worker, almost like economics, if the worker appears, of course the company will realize the utility and hire that person immediately. It doesn't work that way. For example, what Diana said, arbitrary 4-year degree requirements. If someone comes out of a program with the skills that you need, do you care that they have a college degree? The answer should be no. If they can do the job, they should get the job. But if you can't recognize that because your HR process may not have kept up with where the market is, then you're going to keep out talent. And you will, and the worst of all worlds is someone goes through a training program, can do the job, and you can't get the job for them and for you. And so when I think about the critical things that employers need to do that really fit along those screens, and some more tactical things are skills-based hiring. For every job, what is a way that that someone would demonstrate to you that they can do that job? Is it a performance assessment? Is it a digital portfolio where they show you an example of them doing this before? They do it now. You will find, for example, companies in the space industry, they want to know if someone can do fabrication as well as welding, which are not the same thing. They literally will bring someone to a shop floor and they have an exercise where someone will do fabrication on the spot to show that they can do it. Now you've made this about can you do the job versus social capital, who you know, or a credential that maybe, frankly, you couldn't have afforded, even though it may not be relevant. I do think, secondly, taking on the apprenticeship model. And let me be, so those of you who are familiar with the apprenticeship model, what we call registered apprenticeship here in the States. Long story short, someone raises their hand, says, I want to work in a certain field. Company takes them on. They work alongside someone who's been in that field for a while, for times 12 to 24 months, learning the field. And at the end, assuming that they are up to snuff, they go straight into a job. And they are paid along that entire way. One of the powerful things that someone once told me was, they said, if you're trying to diversify your talent pool, I think about all the people who are likely on this call, we were all taught to interview in an episodic format, meaning I show up one time, I charm you, I show you how brilliant I am, and you hire me on the spot because of that one time that I showed you. And I hope that one time is representative of your ability. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. Frankly, those of us who have done that have done it because we have the social capital to be trained on how to do that. Many people in this community who have the skills are not simply trained to do that. What an apprenticeship allows is a longitudinal interview. I can see you over time and see what you can do. And at the end, I can see if you should be in my company or not. Not only is that actually far more accurate, it's actually far more equitable. And we see it in the proof is in the pudding of how much more diverse a pipeline is of talent through an apprenticeship program than through a regular episodic interview. So apology, I'll step off my soapbox now. This is something we're deeply passionate about here at the Department of Labor. But those are some of the very tactical things and global things that a company can do to fill this space, particularly in the technical space where there are labor shortages that could potentially be filled by these changes in practice. And I'm sure Diana has much more coaching things to add.
I have much more to add, so I'm gonna, but I won't. I'll contain myself because I'm actually very passionate about this part of the conversation. For a long time, there's been this hesitancy for employers to invest in upskilling, and we're seeing changes in that now, which is exciting and good and needed and all of that. It's interesting to me how there's a whole body of literature that's about the education to workforce transition, right? Like the education to career transition. It's kind of, why is it so siloed? It should be much more connected. There shouldn't be this whole body of literature that's highlighting the silo. I mean, it's good literature for sure and important because there is this transition, there is a gap. And to me, employers, industry is a part of the education ecosystem. They are important educators, they partner in all different ways at all different levels of educational attainment, right? If you're talking about a community college, you want community colleges to partner with local employers and in a well-designed way, right? So not just one-off conversations, and that gets into a functioning of community colleges, and that's a longer conversation. And these challenges are well documented. You also think about K-12 and partnering with curricula, and thinking about, okay, well, how about some of these experiential learning opportunities? How about building some of these apprenticeships, which have not taken off, in the most robust way in the technology space. And so why? How can we increase that? And some of the latest initiatives coming out last week out of the summit, the Cybersecurity Education and Workforce Summit, are really trying to tackle that head on. And there's also this idea, and then in terms of adult learning, lifelong upskilling, that's an important part of the employer education conversation. So really, they really do play this critical role. And then I'll finally just end with the culture, right? So when we talk about an innovation workforce, you need to, preferably, you're working in an environment that allows and cultivates and nurtures innovative thinking and the freedom to pursue new ideas and maybe take a risk, right? So that is also another element of the conversation here, is about creating cultures where this is allowed to happen and prospers.
Thank you. We do have a question from the audience on the public policy solutions for this. And I think both of you have laid out the need for the more technically proficient workforce, but who should take on this activity, and what would be the metrics for success in this area?
I want to hear mostly what Diana has to say. The only one sentence I'll say here is the answer is everyone. This is no government, no business, no intermediary can solve this by themselves. So the question is not who should, but what should we, and truly the royal collective we should do. But Diana, I would love to hear your thoughts here.
Actually, that's and I know it's a panel that we all agree. There are things that I'm sure we don't agree on, but in this case, I am in complete agreement, because we really think of our work here when we do education and workforce policy recommendations. We are at the nexus of the tech community, education and workforce, or education and labor, and national security community, because in our view, we all have a role to play. This is an all hands on deck conversation, as I say. So I think there is this role, and that's not a cop out, because you could talk about the different levels, right? It goes all the way from federal government to state and local government who administer education policy, right? Who create state standardized learning objectives for classes, and then it goes down to the school district level, it goes down to the teachers, it goes down to the parents and the students, right? And then these partnerships where you come in from a nonprofit or a company to help kind of supplement education in the classroom. And there's as much education that happens outside the classroom. So then you think about how we're learning through other platforms, whether we're doing our own enriched learning through a cloud certification, or are we going to an after school or coding program, coding boot camp, or a summer camp, or are we doing some other enrichment opportunity, right? So you think about all the different ways in which we're learning and building skills of all different kinds. And you quickly realize that everyone not only plays a role, but there are policies look different based on what level of government, or at the, if you're really thinking at the school level, a policy at the school level or at the school district is going to look different than at the state level, where for us today, we said, look, it would be great, 36 states have a computer science state supervisor. Let's build on that infrastructure and start talking about AI education and what that looks like. And so, leveraging what's already in place, but at the state level, that's going to look different than at the federal level, where you'd say, okay, NSF here, as CHIPS Plus does, let's create a new grant program or a new scholarship program to try, or a new hub that's going to try to fund research or to try to help create a new apprenticeship program, right? So the policies are all there and all relevant, and come at different levels.
Great, thank you. One of the questions that comes to mind is, we're thinking about how do we build these pipelines? Are these pipelines going to be similar across all technologies? Or do you envision there being multiple pipelines for the different industries, and even industries that we have not thought of yet?
I expect that they're going to be different and diversified, even within industries, even amongst different segments and different firms, and even which we've not talked about is kind of what different size of firms have to do. What a huge Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 firm is going to do is going to be actually really different from an SME. I mean, this challenge is hard enough for the big folks who have very developed talent infrastructures. But if you're talking about a 500-person firm or a 50-person firm who, quite honestly, the CFO, it might be the CEO, as well as the CHRO, so on and so forth, this is an additional challenge. And so I expect these to look diversified. And one of the things that, and I've said this to many companies and ecosystems, is you have to work together. You have seen you have seen in some industries competitors work together to try and fill particular talent needs. For those of you who've worked in the industry, at times working with a competitor is hard. I have also seen really interesting collaborations across supply chains, where again, all of them are dependent upon each other. And actually, I'm actually very hopeful about those types of collaborations, because obviously there's a true incentive to work together, because their success is is interdependent. But I expect these to look different. But I think one of my hopes is that you see far more collaboration, because I've not seen a firm handle it by itself. And one of my slight fear sometimes is that as certain firms do try and solve this challenge by themselves, they might actually create more fragmentation. So for example, you've seen many firms in the technology space create skill taxonomies, assessments, certifications, things like that. All good in and of itself. The challenge is now in the technology space, I just think about the biggest players. I have probably 5 to 10 different taxonomies, and they're not really different, but they have different nomenclature, things like that. And if I'm a worker, that's a fragmentation that makes my search harder. And so I have made the argument many times, hey, let's get together on that. And that is a hard conversation to have, because in some ways these folks are at odds. And so I do worry about that from the worker perspective in terms of getting to the job. And as well as at times for the companies which in their efforts to solve this in a solo fashion may actually have made their problem worse, not better.
I love that answer, because we actually think a lot. It also not only creates an opportunity for employers to just say, no, forget it, I'm going to use the bachelor's degree. But when you have all of these different competency frameworks, it's not only confusing for the worker, but for the employer or for the organization trying to design the certification. So we think a lot about competency frameworks related to emerging technologies. It's not sexy, right? That's not a sexy topic. Competency framework, standard setting for certifications, but that's actually really important if we want to elevate some of these alternative pathways. And the field is changing so rapidly. We see this huge proliferation of certifications, right? You've got organizations like Credential Engine that say over 1 million different certifications or certificates are out there right now, and they're trying to catalog all of them, and they all come with different standards or self-designed competencies. And if you don't have this cohesive fabric, it just makes this conversation really much more complicated than would really help to be effective.
Okay, great. I believe we have time for maybe one more question here. And so this was a more kind of a comparative. I know we brought up China a little bit in the beginning, but there's a question about, so what is China and other countries doing in this space to create this technically proficient workforce? And how does that compare, whether it is basically state policy, company policies, and how does that play out?
Chiki, do you want to take the first cut, or?
Sure, I'm happy to say a few, and I think you like I'm actually curious to hear what you have to say. I think I will say, when I think about this topic, I actually look the parts of Europe, which I think number one are more applicable to the American context, and I actually think have some lessons for us to learn. One thing you see in a place like Switzerland, where we actually have an MOU with them on the use of apprenticeship, as well as Germany, is that you don't see the stigma around quote unquote non-university tracks. You see a really robust, vocational is not even the word, but I call it applied kind of educational tracks, as well as kind of university tracks. They are seen equally, they're equally rigorous and viewed as equally desirable. And really it's a choice for the student to make. You also see much tighter collaboration between industry and government and kind of intermediaries around training than I think you see here in the States, just very bluntly. And some of that is just a difference in economic system, but that collaboration is critical. So one, they actually have institutions at a much earlier age producing some of this technical talent. Secondly, they have this tighter collaboration to inform that training so that it's more aligned to industry needs. And lastly, you have something that's just a little more cultural, which is that, hey, we don't value one more than the other. And you see this, I think, yes, definitely in your aerospace engineers and things like that. But you're also seeing, again, what we call this kind of skilled technical workforce, where you have this rising need for what we would call here in the States skilled trades, but again, applying welding and fabrication on sort of testing and quality control to these new industries. I think here's the one thing I'll say about China. Here's the one thing I'll say, and I'm really curious to hear what Diana says. One can argue with China, and I won't compare, but I'll just say it, which is blunt. They have focused on this. This is a strategic priority as a nation. I think nothing that you don't focus on gets done. And one thing you can say for the Chinese government is that they have focused on this as a national priority and put national resources towards it. But Diana, would love to hear your thoughts here.
My thoughts build on exactly that. So one of my colleagues, Dahlia Peterson, has done fantastic work really digging into this question, actually. So we had a paper out last year looking at AI education in China relative to AI education in the United States. And you can see the differences in our education systems, and not that we, what our system is inherently inferior. It's not at all. We have a lot of innovation happening in our education system. There's a lot of exciting programs. There are states that are doing great work when it comes to AI education. And we've got a world-class workforce in a lot of ways, right? So that this is not to say that, but it is to say that China has strategically, thoughtfully made AI education a priority, made building its technical workforce a priority, and has invested a lot of dollars into this cause. And their Ministry of Education can say, go put this in the curriculum, and then it goes out to the provinces. And Anna, I know you have thoughts on this too, so absolutely, I'm curious to know what you think. There is this dedication, this focus. There is a creation of the AI major at colleges. It's now one of the most popular majors. 440 institutions have the approved AI major. So again, in this case, the Ministry of Education approves the major. And there is this really close partnership with industry. We're looking at AI institutes right now. So it's kind of analogous to the NSF's Centers for Academic Excellence in Artificial Intelligence. There's AI institutes in China, and we're looking into what these institutes are funding, what type of research, the educational component to these institutes, because they really are collaborations with industry and also housed at a university where they are training talent. And the other piece that we're doing in looking at the workforce is from a demand side. We have this very unique data set of 7 million job postings, and we're really understanding what are employers asking for. Let's use job demand to help get insights into this question as to what young college graduates are coming out with in terms of skills and degrees. Let's really understand what types of employers are hiring this talent, and really kind of wrap our arms around what's happening in that country. But there really is this close partnership with industry. It really is a strategic area of focus and investment. And you can see the numbers of college graduates this country certainly has its own challenges with, young underemployment of young college graduates. But there's a very different focus and mindset when it comes to technical talent and technical education. And finally, I'll say that they have a much bigger emphasis than we do on vocational or career and technical education. And they are building these types of institutions around the world to train talent. So it's not even just in China that they're focusing on educating and training technical talent. They're doing it in other parts of the world as well.
Thank you. That is really interesting. And I think that raised a little bit at the beginning, the comparison of, okay, that strategic focus and whether that, at the tactical level, but also putting in place those programs. Okay, well, I think that I will hand it back over to Lynn.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I'd like to thank not only Anna as our moderator and as a contributor to the panel, but also co-panelist Diana Gelhaus and our featured invited speaker, Chike Agu. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to everyone who joined us today to take part in this discussion. You enlivened it with your insightful questions, and glad you were here. If you'd like to learn more about CSET, please go to cset.georgetown.edu and sign up for our newsletter and research updates. We'll be taking an August break from this virtual world, but we're already looking forward to inviting you to our next webinar, which will take place on September 22nd, and will focus on CSET's growing body of research at the intersection of national security and biotechnology. In the meantime, look for our email tomorrow with follow-up from today's event, as well as details on where to find the video recording. Take care, and we hope to see you again real soon.